The Psychology of Money Postscript, a brief history of why the US consumer thinks the way they do. To understand the psychology of the modern consumer and to grasp where they might be heading next, you have to know how they got here. How we all got here. If you fell asleep in 1945 and woke up in 2020, you would not recognize the word around you. The amount of economic growth that took place during that period is virtually unprecedented. If you saw the level of wealth in New York and San Francisco, you would be shocked. If you compared it to the poverty of Detroit, you would be shocked. If you saw the price of homes, college tuitions, and healthcare, you would be shocked. If you saw how average Americans think about savings and spending in general, you would be shocked. And if you try to think of a reasonable narrative of how it all happened, my guess is you would be totally wrong because it is not intuitive and it foreseeable what happened in America since the end of World War II. The story of the American consumer, it is a story that helps explain why people think about the money, the why they do today. The short story is this: things were very uncertain, then they were very good, then pretty bad, then really good, then really bad, and now here are we are. And there is how think a narrative that links all those events together. Not a detailed account, but a story of how things fit together. Since this is an attempt to link the big events together, it leaves out many details of what happened during this period. I am likely to agree with anyone who points out what I have missed. The goal here is not to describe every play, it is to look at how one game influenced the next. Here is how the modern consumer got here. First, August 1945, World War II ends. Japan surrendering was the happiest day in American history. The New York Times wrote, but there is a saying, history is just one damn thing after another. The joy of war ending was quickly met with the question, what happens now? 16 million Americans, 11% of the population, served in the war. About 8 million were overseas at the end. Their average age was 23. Within 18 months, all but 1.5 million of them would be home and out of uniform. And then what? What were they going to the next? Where were they going to work? Where were they going to live? Those were the most important question of the day for two reasons. One, no one knew the answer. Two, if they couldn't be answered quickly, the most scenario in the eyes of many economists was that the economy would slip back into the depth of the Great Depressions. Three forces had built up during the war. First, housing construction ground to be a halt as virtually all the production capacity was shifted to building war supplies. Fewer than 12,000 homes per month were built in 1943, equivalent to less than one new home per American city. Returning soldiers faced a severe housing shortage. Second, the specific job created during the war, building ships, tanks, and planes, were very suddenly not necessary after it, stopping with a speed and magnitude rarely seen in private business. It was unclear where soldier could work. 3. The marriage rate spiked during the immediately after the war. Soldiers did not want to return to their mother's basement. They wanted to start a family in their own home with a good job right away. This worried policymakers, especially since the Great Depression was still a recent memory, having ended just 5 years prior. In 1946, the Council of Economic Advisers delivered a report to President Truman warning of a full scale depression sometime in the next 1 to 4 years. They wrote in a separate 1947 memo summarizing a meeting with Truman. We might be in some sort of recession period where we should have to be sure of our ground as to whether recessionary forces might be in danger of getting out of hand. There is a substantial prospects which should not be overlooked that a further decline may increase the danger of a downward spiral into depression conditions. Was exacerbated by the fact that exports couldn't be immediately relied upon for growth as two of the largest economies, Europe and Japan, sat in ruins dealing with the humanitarian crisis, and America itself was buried in more debt than ever before, limiting government stimulus. So we did something about it. Second, low interest rates and the intentional birth of American consumer. The first thing we did to keep the economy afloat after the war was keep interest rates low. This was not an easy decision because when soldiers came home to shortage of everything from clothes to cars, it temporarily sent inflation into double digit. The Federal Reserve was not politically independent before 1951. The President and the Fed could coordinate policy in 1942. The Fed announced it would keep short term rates at 0.38% to help finance the wars. Rates did not budge a single basis point for the next 7 years. 3 month Treasury yields stayed below 2% until the mid 1950s. The explicit reason for keeping rates down was to keep the cost of financing, the equivalent of $6 trillion, was spent on the war low. But low rates also did something else for all returning GIs. It made borrowing to buy homes, cars, gadgets, and toys really cheap, which from a paranoid policymaker's perspective was great consumption became an explicit economic strategy in the years after World War II. An era of encouraging thrift and saving to fund the war quickly turned into an era of actively promoting spending. Princeton historian Sheldon Garin writes, after 1945, America again diverged from patterns of saving promotion in Europe and East Asia. Politicians, businessmen, and labor leaders all encouraged Americans to spend to foster economic growth. Two things fueled this push. One was the GI Bill, which offered unprecedented mortgage opportunities. 6 million veterans buy a home often with no money down, no interest in the first year, and fixed rates so low that monthly mortgage payments could be lower than a rental. The second was an explosion of consumer credits enabled by the loosening of Depression era regulation. The first credit card was introduced in 1950. Store credit, installment credit, personal loans, pay date loans, everything took off, and interest on all debt, including credit cards, was tax deductible at the time. It tasted delicious, so we ate a lot of it. A simple story in a simple table. In 1945, $29.4 billion. In 1955, $125.7 billion. In 1965, $331.2 billion. Household debt in 1950s grew 1.5 times faster than it did during the 2000 debt splurge. Third, pent up demand for stuff fed by a credit room and a hidden 1930s productivity boom led to an economic boom. The 1930s were the hardest economic decade in American history, but there was a silver lining that took 2 decades to notice. By necessity, the Great Depression had supercharged resourcefulness, productivity, and innovation. We didn't pay that much attention to the productivity boom in the 30s because everyone was focused how bad the economy was. We didn't pay attention to it in the 40s because everyone was focused on the war. Then the 1950s came around and we suddenly realized how we have some amazing new inventions and we are really good at making them. Appliances, cars, phones, air conditioning, electricity. It was nearly impossible to buy many household goods during the war because factories were converted to make guns and ships that created pent up demand from GIs for stuff after the wars ended, married, eager to get on with life, and emboldened with new cheap consumer credits. They went on a buying spree like the country had never seen. Frederick Louis Allen writes in this book, The Big Change. During these post war years, the farmer bought a new tractor, a corn picker, an electric milking machine. In fact, he and his neighbors between them assembled a formidable array of farm machinery for their joint use. The farmer's wife got the shining white electric refrigerator she had always longed for, the never during the Great Depression had been able to afford, and an up to date washing machine and a deep freeze unit. The suburban family installed a dishwashing machine and invested in a power lawnmower. The city family became customers of a laundromat and acquired a television set for the living room. The husband's office were air conditions, and so on endlessly. It is hard to overstate how big this surge was. Commercial car and truck manufacturing virtually ceased from 1940 to 1945. Then, 21 million cars were sold from 1945 to 1949. Another 37 million were sold by 1955. Just under 2 million homes were built from 1940 to 1945, and then 7 million were built from 1945 to 1950. Another 8 million were built by 1955. Pent up demand for stuff and our newfound ability to make stuff created the jobs that put returning GIs back to work. And they were good jobs too. Mix that with consumer credits, and America's capacity for spending exploded. The Federal Reserve wrote to President Truman in 1951. By 1950, that total consumer expenditure together with residential construction amounted to about $203 billion, or in the neighborhood of 40% above the 1944 level. The answer to the question, what are all these GIs going to do after the war? Now obvious. They were going to buy stuff with money earned from their jobs, making new stuff, held by cheap borrowed money to buy even more stuff. Gains are shared more equally than ever before. The defining characteristic of economics in 1950s is that the country got rich by making the poor less poor. Average wages doubled from 1940s to 1948, then double again by 1963, and those gains focused on those who had been left behind for decades before. The gap between rich and poor narrowed by an extraordinary amount. Louis Allen wrote in 1955. The enormous lead of the well to do in the economic race was being considerably reduced. It is the industrial workers who, as a group, have done best. Pupils such as Sweet Workers family, who used to live on $2,500 and now are getting $4,500, or the highly skilled machine tool operators family, who used to have 3,000 and now can spend an annual $5,500 or more. As for the top 1%, the really well to do and the rich, whom we might classify very roughly indeed as the $16,000 and over group, their share of the total national income after taxes had come down by 1945 from 13% to 7%. This was not a short term trend. Real income for the bottom 20% of wages earner grew by a nearly identical amount as the top 5% from 1950 to 1980. The equality went beyond wages. Women held jobs outside the home in record numbers. Their labor force participation rate went from 31% after the war to 37% by 1955 and to 40% by 1965. Minorities gained too. After the 1945 inaugurations, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote about an African American reporter who told her. You realize what 12 years have done. If at the 1933 reception a number of colored people had gone down the line and mixed with everyone else in the way they did today, every paper in the country would have reported it. We did not even think it is news, and none of us will mention it. And minorities' rights were still a fraction of that they are today. But the progress towards equality in the late 40s and 50s was extraordinary. The leveling out of classes meant a leveling out of lifestyles. Normal people drove Chevys, rich people drove Cadillacs. TV and radio equalized the entertainment and culture people enjoy regardless of class. Mail order catalogs equalized the clothes people wore and the goods they bought regardless of where they are lived. This magazine noted in 1957 the rich man smokes the same sort of cigarettes as the poor man, shaves with the same sort of razor, uses the same sort of telephone, vacuum cleaner, radio, and TV set, has the same sort of lighting and heating equipment in his house, and so on indefinitely. The differences between the automobile and the poor man's are minor. Essentially, they have similar engines, similar fittings, and in the early years of the century, there was a hierarchy of automobiles. Paul Graham wrote in 2016 about what something as simple as there only being three TV stations did to equalize culture. It is difficult to imagine now, but every tens of millions of families would sit down together in front of their TV sets watching the same show at the same time as their next door neighbors. What happens now with the Super Bowl used to happen every night. We are literally in sync. This was important. People measure their well being against their peer, and for the most of 1945-1980 period, people had a lot of what looked like peers to compare themselves to. Many pupils, most people lived lives that were either equal or at least fathomable to those around them. The idea that pupils live equalized as much as their income as an important point of the story we will come back to. Debt rose tremendously, but so did income, so the impact was not a big deal. Household debt increased fivefold from 1947 to 1957 due to the combination of the new consumption culture, new debt products, and interest rate subsidized by government programs and held low by the Federal Reserve. But income growth was so strong during this period that the impact on household was not severe. Household debt was so low to begin with after the war. The Great Depression wiped out a lot of it, and household spending was so curtailed during the war that debt accumulation was restricted. The growth in household debt to income from 1947 to 1957 was manageable. Household debt to income today is just over 100% even after rising in 1950s, 1960s and 1970s. It stayed below 60%. Driving a lot of this debt boom was a surge in home ownership. The home ownership rate in 1900 was 47%. It stayed right about there for the next 4 decades. Then it took off, hitting 53% by 1945 and 62% by 1977. A substantial portion of population was now using debt was previous generation could not have accessed, and they were mostly okay with it. David Halberton writes in this book, The 50s, they were confident in themselves and their futures in a way that growing up in harder times found striking. They did not fear death as their parents had. They differed from their parents not just in how much they made and what they owned, but in their belief that the future had already arrived. As the first homeowners in their families, They brought a new excitement and pride with them to the store as they bought furniture or appliances. In other time, young couples might have exhibited such feeling as they bought clothes for their first baby. Was if the very accomplishment of owning a home reflected such as immense breakthrough that nothing was too good to buy for it. Now's a good time to connect a few things as they will become increasingly important. America is booming. It's a booming together like never before. It's a booming with debt that isn't a big deal at the time because it is still low relative to income, and there is a culture acceptance that debt is not a scary thing. 6. Things start cracking. 1973 was the first year where it became clear the economy was walking down a new path. The recession that began that year, unemployment to the highest it had been since the 1930s. Inflation surged, but unlike the post war spikes, it stayed high. Short term interest rate hit 8% in 1973, up from 2.5% a decade earlier. And you have to put all of that in the context of how much fear there was between Vietnam rights assassination of Martin Luther King and John and Bobby Kennedy. It's got bleak. America dominated the world economy in the 2 decades after the war. Many of the largest countries had their manufacturing capacity bombed into rubble. But as the 1970s emerged, that changed. Japan was booming, China's economy was opening up, the Middle East was flexing its oil muscles. A combination of lucky economic advantage and a culture shared by the greatest generation, hardened by the depression and anchored in systematic cooperation from the war, shifted when baby boomers began coming of age. A new generation that had a different view of what's normal hit at the same time. A lot of the economic tailwinds of the previous 2 decades ended. Everything in finance is data. Within the context of expectation, one of the biggest shifts of the last century happened when the economic winds began blowing in different, uneven direction, but pupils' expectation was still rooted in a post-war culture of equality. Not necessarily quality of income, although there was that, but equality in lifestyle and consumption expectation. The idea that someone earning a 50th percentile income shouldn't live a life dramatically different than someone in the 18th or 19th percentile. That someone in the 1990th percentile lived a better life but is still a life that someone in the 15th percentile could comprehend. That is how America worked for the most of the 1945 to 1980 period. It doesn't matter whether you think that is morally right or wrong, it just matters that it happened. Expectation always moves slower than facts, and the economic facts of the years between the early 1970s to the early 2000s were that growth continued but became more uneven, yet pupils' expectation of how their lifestyle should compare to their peers did not change. The boom resumes, but it's different than before. Ronald Reagan's 1984 Morning in America ad declared, "It's a morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history, with interest rate at about half the records high of 1980. Nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes more than at any times in the past 4 years. The afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married, and with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with the confidence to the future." That wasn't hyperbole. GDP growth was the highest it had been since the 1950s. By 1989, there were 6 million fewer unemployed Americans than there were 7 years before. The S&P 500 rose almost fourfold between 1982 and 1990. Total real GDP growth in the 1990s was roughly equal to that of the 1950s, 40% versus 42%. President Clinton boasted in his 2000 States of the Union speech, "We begin the new century with over 20 million new jobs, the fastest economic growth in more than 30 years, the lowest unemployment rates in 30 years, the lowest poverty rates in 20 years, the lowest African American and Hispanic unemployment rates on records, the first back to back surplus in 42 years. And next month, America will achieve the longest period of economic growth in our entire history. We have built a new economy." His last sentence was important. It was a new economy. The biggest difference between the economy of the 1945 to 1973 period and that of the 1982 to 2000 period was that the same amount of the growth fund found its way into totally different pockets. You have probably heard these numbers, but they are worth rehashing. The Atlantic Rise. Between 1993 and 2012, the top 1% saw their incomes grow 86.1%, while the bottom 99% saw just 6.6% growth. Joseph Stiglitz in 2011, while the top 1% have seen their incomes rise 18% over the past decades, those in the middle have actually seen their income fall. For men with only high school degree, the decline has been precipitous. 12% in the last quarter century alone. It was nearly opposite of the flattening that occurred after the war. Why this happened is one of the nastiest debates in economies, topped only by the debate over what we should do about it. Lucky for the purpose of the discussion, neither matters. All that matters in the sharp inequality became a force over the last 35 years, and it happened during a period where culturally Americans held on to two ideas rooted in the post WW2 economy: that you should live a lifestyle similar to most other Americans, and that taking on debt to finance that lifestyle is acceptable. Eighth, the big stretch. Rising income among a small group of Americans led to that group breaking away in lifestyle. They bought bigger homes, nicer cars, went to expensive schools, and took fancy vacations. And everyone else was watching, fueled by Madison Avenue in the 80s and 90s and the internet after that. The lifestyles of a small portion of legitimately rich Americans created the aspiration of the majority of Americans whose incomes were not rising. A culture of equality and togetherness that came out of the 1950s to 1970s innocently morphs into a keeping up with the Jones effect. Now you can see the problem. Joe, an investment banker making $9 million a year, buys a 4,000 square foot house with two Mercedes and sends three of his kids to Pepperdine. He can afford it. Peter, a bank branch manager making $80,000 a year, sees Jones and feels a subconscious sense of entitlement to live a similar lifestyle because Peter's parents believed and instilled in him that Americans' lifestyles were not that different even if they had different jobs. His parents were right during their era because income fell into a tight distribution, but that was then. Peter lives in a different world because his expectations haven't changed much from his parents, even if the facts have. So, what does Peter do? He takes out a huge mortgage. He has $45,000 of credit card debt. He leases two cars. His kids will graduate with heavy student loans. He can't afford the stuff Joe can. but he is pushed to stretch for the same lifestyle. It is a big stretch. It would have seemed preposterous to someone in 1930s, but we have spent 75 years since the end of the war fostering a culture acceptance of household debt. During a time when median wages were flat, the median new American home grew 50% larger. The average new American's home now has more bathrooms than occupants. Nearly half have four or more bedrooms, up from 18% in 1983. The average car loans adjusted for inflation more than doubled between 1975 to 2003, from $12,300 to $27,900. And you know what happened to college cost and student loans. Household debt to income stayed about flat from 1963 to 1973. Then it climbed and climbed and climbed from around 60% in 1973 to more than 130% by 2007. Even as interest rates plunged from early 1980s through 2020, the percentage of income going to debt service payments rose, and it skewed towards lower income groups. The share of income going towards debt and lease payments in just over 8% for the highest income groups, those with the biggest income gains, but over 21% for those below the 50th percentile. The difference between the climbing this debt and the debt increase that took place during the 1950s to 60s is that the recent jump started from a high base. Economist Hyman Minsky described the beginning of debt crisis, the moment when people take on more debt than they can service. It is an ugly, painful moment. It's like while E. Saito looking down, realizing he's screwed and falling precipitously, which of course is what happened in 2008. 9. Once a paradigm is in place, it's very hard to turn it around. A lot of debt was shed after 2008 and then interest rates plunged. Household debt payment as a percentage of income are now at the lowest levels in 35 years. But the response to 2008, necessary as it may have been, perpetuate some of the trends that got us here. Quantitative easing both prevented economic collapse and boosted asset price, a boon for those who owned them, mostly rich people. The Fed backstopped corporate debt in 2008 that helped those who owned that debt, mostly rich people. Tax cuts over the last 20 years have predominantly gone to those with higher incomes. People with higher incomes send their kids to the best college. Those kids can go on to earn higher income and invest in corporate debt that will be backstopped by the Fed. Own stocks that will be supported by various government policies and so on. None of these things are problem in and of themselves, which is why they stay in place. But they are asymptomatic of the bigger thing that has happened since the early 1980s. The economy works better for some people than others. This is not a meritocratic as it used to be, and when success is granted, it's rewarded with higher gains than in previous. You don't have to think that is morally right or wrong. And again, in this story, it doesn't matter why it happened. It's just matter that it did happen, and it caused the economy to shift away from people's expectation that was set after the war, that there is a broad middle class without systematic inequality where your neighbor next door and a few miles down the road live a life that is pretty similar to yours. Part of the reason these expectations have stuck around for 35 years after they shifted away from reality is because they felt so good for so many people when they were valid. something that good, or at least the impression that it was that good, isn't easy to let go of. So people haven't let go of it, they want it back. 10th, the Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, Brexit, and Donald Trump each represent a group shouting, "Stop the right I want of." The details of their shouting are different, but they are all shouting, at least in part, because stuff is not working for them within the context of the post war expectation that stuff should work roughly the same for roughly everyone. You can scoff at linking the rise of Trump to income inequality alone, and you should. These things are always layers of complexity deep, but it's a key part of what drives people to think, "I don't live in the world I expected." That pisses me off. So screw these and screw you. I am going to fight for something totally different because this, whatever it is not working. Take that mentality and raise it to power of Facebook, Instagram, and cable news, where people are more keenly aware of how other people live than ever before. It's a gasoline on a flame. Benedict even says the more the internet exposes people to new points of view, the angrier people get that different views exist. That is a big shift from the post war economy where the ranges of economic opinions were smaller, both because the actual range of outcomes was lower and because it was not as easy to see and learn what other people thought and how they lived. I am not pessimistic. Economics is the story of cycles. Things come, things go. The unemployment rate is now the lowest it's been in decades. Wages are now actually growing faster for low income workers than the rich. College costs by and large stopped growing once grants are factored in. If everyone studied advance in healthcare, communication, transportation, and civil rights since the glorious 1950s, my guess is most wouldn't want to go back. But a central theme of the story is that expectations move slower than reality on the ground. That was true when people clung to 1950s expectations as the economy changed over the next 35 years. And even if a middle class boom began today, expectations that the odds are staked against everyone but those at the top may stick around. So the era of this is not working may stick around, and the era of the we need something radically new right now, whatever it is, may stick around. Which in a way is a part of that stars event that led to things like World War II, where this story began. History is just one damn thing after another.